Hello everyone, my name is Sonakshi Sinha and I work as a manager in the data privacy and legal team at Pro India. Today we are going to discuss the term consent under the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023. This is the most important term under the regulation. What is consent? Now consent is basically taking somebody's approval to process their personal data. Consent is basically your individual approval for you to process the personal data for the purposes that you have specified. Why consent becomes important? Because without consent, an organization is not allowed to do the processing of the personal data of the individual. Now, how a consent should look like? A consent should always be a free consent. So, whenever we are collecting consent as an organization, we have to make sure that the consent is a free consent and we are collecting it basis that consent is given by the individual freely, and we are not bundling that individual with any kind of services, providing any kind of services or any other terms and condition for providing the consent. So consent with or without any conditions would be applicable only when it is a free consent. We cannot force anybody to provide their consent, and hence we start doing the processing of that particular individual. This is not allowed under the regulation. Second major point with respect to consent is that whenever we are collecting any kind of consent, the consent should be informed and specific. So when we are collecting the consent, we have to make sure that we inform the individual for which purposes are we collecting the consent, and also we have to make sure that consent, whenever we are collecting, it is a specified consent. The third point or the third thing that we have to keep in mind when we are collecting consent or when we are asking for consent is the consent should not be unambiguous. So we should not vaguely collect consent of the individual is what the regulation says. Unambiguous consents are something that will not be considered as consent under the regulation. It should always be a specific consent. A consent for a specific purpose should be collected by the organization, and if in case we are collecting any kind of unambiguous consent, not a freely consent, or the purpose of the consent is not specified, I think as an organization we should stop doing it. Next major thing that we have to keep in mind when we are collecting consent is the consent should not be conditional consent. Again, a condition should not be attached to the consent. Consent should always be a conditionless consent, and if we are anyway putting any kind of conditions, that condition should not go against the individual. So for example, if we are saying if we are telling the individual that we will be providing you the services when you provide us the consent, this is somewhere acceptable, but if we start forcing individual to give their consent for a specific purpose they don't want to, that is not acceptable. Next point to remember is a consent should be in plain language. Whenever we are collecting any kind of consent, we should provide the purpose of the consent and other information in a plain, easily readable language. We should not write a language, we should not collect consent, or we should not write the information in a language which the individual cannot understand. So language, we have to make sure that the language of the whenever we are collecting any kind of consent should be understandable to the individual from where we are collecting the consent. So these are the few points that we have to keep in mind when we are collecting consent or we are planning to collect any kind of consent. One more thing that is very important with respect to consent is that consent when we are collecting consent from the individual, we also have to give them an opportunity. In case they want to withdraw the consent, they can do that, and that opportunity an organization has to provide to the individual. So how we are going to provide this information or this opportunity to the individual? First thing, whenever we are sending out emails to the individual, we make sure that we are putting their unsubscribe button or unsubscribe link, using which an individual can unsubscribe from our list, and they can withdraw their right, they can withdraw their consent. The second way in which we can ask the individual to withdraw consent is providing the contact details of the DPO or the privacy officer who can help them to withdraw their consent. We need to, as an organization, we need to have an identified process internally. Whenever an individual is asking us to withdraw their consent, we should immediately react to it. We should immediately take back the consent. We should allow the individual to take back their consent, and for that matter, we have to stop sending them emails. We have to stop contacting them because they have asked us to do that. So these were the very important points with respect to consent, and we should always, as an organization, keep these things in mind whenever we are collecting consent for processing the personal data of the individual. The second very important point is that we should have the record of these consent that the individual has provided. The records of consent should be maintained by the organization, and that is very important for an organization. From the organization point of view, these records should be maintained by the organization. I hope this small video was very useful for you to understand the concept of consent and what you can do when you're collecting consent and what you cannot do. We will be happy to answer any of your queries, if at all you have, with respect to consent or any other topic on the DPDPA Act. Thank you very much for watching this video.